Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary people. In a crowded restaurant where conversations blend into background noise and strangers pass by without a second glance, heroes walk among us completely unnoticed. They order coffee like everyone else, check their phones, laugh with friends, and blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. But beneath their casual clothes and relaxed smiles lies training that could save lives, skills that could change everything, and a brotherhood forged in the world's most dangerous places. What happens when that hidden world suddenly breaks through? When 3 simple words spoken across a restaurant floor transform an ordinary evening into something that reminds us that real heroes don't always wear uniforms, don't always announce themselves, and sometimes sit quietly at table 6, waiting for the moment when their true calling reveals itself. This is the story of such a moment. When the invisible became visible, when the unnoticed became unforgettable, and when a simple dinner became a reminder that extraordinary people live extraordinary lives, even when they're just trying to enjoy a quiet meal. The Friday evening crowd at Romano's Italian restaurant moved with the familiar rhythm of weekend anticipation. Servers weaved between tables, carrying steaming plates of pasta and fresh bread, while the gentle hum of conversation mixed with the soft jazz playing overhead. It was the kind of place where families celebrated birthdays, couples shared anniversary dinners, and friends gathered to catch up after long weeks at work. At table 6, near the window overlooking the parking lot, sat Marcus Thompson. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another customer enjoying his evening meal. His dark hair was cut neat, but not military short. His button-down shirt was casual but well-fitted, and his demeanor was relaxed as he scrolled through his phone between bites of chicken parmesan. Nothing about his appearance suggested that just 18 months earlier, he had been part of a classified mission in Syria that had saved the lives of 12 hostages. Marcus had chosen this particular table deliberately, though not for the view. The position gave him clear sight lines to both entrances, allowed him to observe the restaurant's traffic patterns, and provided multiple exit routes if needed. These weren't conscious thoughts anymore, they were simply how he moved through the world now. Automatic assessments that happened as naturally as breathing. His teammates would have recognized the positioning immediately, but to everyone else, he was just a guy who preferred window seats. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been harder than he'd expected. Not because of dramatic flashbacks or obvious trauma, but because of the subtle ways his training had rewired his brain. He noticed things other people missed. The nervous energy of the young man at table 3 who kept checking his watch, the way the older woman near the bar held her purse closer when certain patrons walked by, the slight bulge under the sport coat of the man who'd entered alone and sat facing the room. Most of the time, these observations meant nothing. A nervous date, typical urban caution, an off-duty police officer. But Marcus couldn't turn off the awareness any more than he could stop his heart from beating. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah, asking if he was still coming to his nephew's soccer game tomorrow. He smiled and typed back his confirmation, adding a joke about bringing his cowbell. This was the life he was building now. Uncle duties, community involvement, a job at a local security consulting firm that used his skills without requiring him to deploy halfway around the world. It was good work, helping small businesses and residential complexes improve their safety protocols. It wasn't the adrenaline rush of special operations, but it had meaning, and it let him sleep in his own bed every night. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted slightly as a group of 4 young men entered, their energy noticeably different from the relaxed dinner crowd. They moved with the restless confidence of people looking for entertainment, speaking loudly enough that nearby conversations paused. Marcus glanced up from his phone, his trained eye automatically cataloging details. College age, probably, though something about their swagger suggested they were used to getting their way. The hostess guided them to a table across the room, and Marcus returned his attention to his meal, filing the observation away without concern. Sarah's next text included a photo of 8-year-old Tyler in his soccer uniform, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Marcus found himself genuinely smiling for the first time all day. This was what mattered now, being present for family moments, building relationships that weren't based on life or death trust, learning to find purpose in peaceful pursuits. The adjustment hadn't been easy, but moments like these reminded him why he'd made the choice to step back from active duty. The young men's voices grew louder, punctuated by harsh laughter that made several nearby diners glance in their direction. Marcus noticed the change in the room's energy, conversations becoming more subdued, some families beginning to look uncomfortable. He watched as their server, a college-age girl with curly red hair, approached their table with visible reluctance. Her body language was professional but tense, the kind of forced cheerfulness that servers develop when dealing with difficult customers. Through the ambient noise, Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Sports betting, someone's father's connections, dismissive comments about the restaurant's clientele. Nothing particularly alarming, just the kind of entitled behavior that made other people's evenings less pleasant. The server took their drink orders and retreated quickly, her relief obvious even from across the room. Marcus returned to his phone, scrolling through messages from former teammates who were scattered across the country now. Jake had started a construction business in Colorado. Mike was teaching high school in Ohio. Tommy was still active duty but talking about retirement. They stayed in touch through a group chat that mixed family updates with inside jokes that would mean nothing to outsiders. It was their way of maintaining the brotherhood that had once been the center of their world. The disruption started small. Raised voices from the young men's table, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Marcus looked up to see their server standing beside their table, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. One of the men was on his feet, gesturing aggressively while the others laughed. Other diners were staring now, the comfortable restaurant atmosphere replaced by the tension that comes when everyone senses trouble brewing but hopes someone else will handle it. Marcus set down his phone and focused his attention on the situation. The standing man was clearly intoxicated, despite having been in the restaurant for less than 20 minutes. His movements were exaggerated, his voice carrying across the room, as he berated the server for some perceived slight in their service. The manager, a middle-aged man in a tie who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, appeared at the table to try to defuse the situation. The conversation that followed was one-sided. The intoxicated customer made unreasonable demands while his friends encouraged him with laughter and comments. The manager offered accommodations, a different table, complimentary drinks, anything to restore peace to his establishment. But it was clear that the group was more interested in causing a scene than in actually resolving any legitimate complaint. Marcus watched the server's face flush with embarrassment and frustration. She was probably working her way through college, depending on tips to pay rent, trying to maintain her composure while being publicly humiliated by someone who saw her as entertainment rather than as a person deserving basic respect. The familiar anger that had driven him through years of training and deployment began to stir, but he forced himself to remain seated. This wasn't his fight. He was off duty, trying to live a normal life, working to leave his warrior instincts in the past where they belonged. The situation escalated when the standing man grabbed the server's wrist, apparently to emphasize some point in his rant. Marcus saw her flinch, saw the fear that replaced embarrassment in her expression, saw the way other diners looked away rather than get involved. The manager stepped forward, his voice firm but not aggressive, asking the customer to release the young woman and lower his voice. That's when Marcus heard the word that changed everything. Not shouted, not dramatic, just spoken clearly from across the room in a voice that carried, despite the chaos, a single word that every member of his former unit would recognize, that had been drilled into them as the universal signal that a situation had moved beyond acceptable boundaries, a word that meant the time for patience had ended and action was required. The word came from table 9, where a man Marcus hadn't noticed before sat alone with a barely touched plate of food. Average height, unremarkable clothes, the kind of person who blended into any crowd. But something about the way he sat, the way his eyes had been tracking the situation, and especially the calm authority with which he'd spoken that single word, told Marcus everything he needed to know. He wasn't the only veteran in the restaurant that night, and his quiet evening was about to become something entirely different. The word had been escalation, not shouted as a warning, but spoken with the measured clarity of someone providing tactical assessment. Marcus's head turned toward table 9, and his eyes met those of the man who'd spoken. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. They'd never served together, never met before this moment, but they knew each other in the way that only comes from sharing the same training, the same commitment, the same willingness to put themselves between danger and innocent people. The man at table 9 was older, probably early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years in harsh climates and difficult circumstances. His posture was relaxed but ready, his attention split between his dinner and the unfolding situation. When Marcus caught his eye, the man nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that conveyed volumes. He was assessing the threat level, waiting to see if civilian authority could handle the situation, but prepared to act if necessary. Marcus felt the familiar shift in his awareness, the heightened focus that came when a situation moved from observation to potential action. Time seemed to slow as his training kicked in, analyzing the restaurant layout with tactical precision. 12 tables occupied, approximately 30 civilians including staff. 2 exits, main entrance and emergency exit near the kitchen. The troublemakers were positioned centrally, giving them visual control of most of the room, but also making them visible to everyone present. The drunken customer had released the server's wrist but was now inches from her face, his voice rising as he made increasingly aggressive demands. His 3 companions seemed to view the spectacle as entertainment, recording portions on their phones while making comments that only encouraged more extreme behavior. The manager looked overwhelmed, clearly hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to take decisive action. Other diners were responding in predictable ways. Some pretended not to notice, staring intently at their food while hoping someone else would handle the problem. Others watched with uncomfortable fascination the way people slowed down to look at car accidents. A few families with children were quietly asking for their checks, wanting to leave before things got worse. The staff moved nervously, unsure whether to continue normal service or prepare for the situation to deteriorate further. Marcus caught the eye of the man at table 9 again. This time, the older veteran raised 2 fingers slightly, a subtle signal indicating he assessed the threat level as moderate but manageable. Marcus responded with a slight nod, acknowledging the assessment while indicating his readiness to support if needed. They were communicating in a language invisible to everyone else in the restaurant, coordinating without words based on shared training and experience. The situation shifted again when the drunken man decided the manager's attempts at appeasement were insufficient. He pushed past the middle-aged man with enough force to send him stumbling backward into a nearby table, sending water glasses crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to wake up the entire restaurant. Several people gasped. Children started crying, and the general murmur of conversation died completely. Now the drunk was standing in the center of the restaurant floor, arms outstretched, as if challenging anyone present to confront him. His friends were laughing and cheering, apparently delighted that their evening's entertainment had escalated to actual physical confrontation. The server had retreated behind the bar, visibly shaking, while the manager picked himself up from the floor and tried to decide whether to call the police or attempt further negotiation. Marcus watched the man at table 9 carefully place his napkin beside his plate and stand up. The movement was unhurried but purposeful, the kind of controlled motion that suggested serious physical training and absolute confidence. He wasn't large or particularly intimidating to look at, but something about his presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Even the drunk seemed to sense it, his bravado faltering slightly as he found himself facing someone who wasn't backing down. The veteran from table 9 walked slowly toward the center of the conflict, his hands visible and non-threatening, but his posture unmistakably that of someone prepared for whatever might happen next. He stopped about 6 feet from the drunk, just outside arm's reach, but close enough to act quickly if necessary. When he spoke, his voice was calm and carried easily through the silent restaurant. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing all 4 troublemakers but focusing primarily on the leader, "I think it's time for you to settle your bill and head home for the evening." The drunk turned his full attention to this new challenger, apparently delighted to have found someone willing to engage with him. "Oh, really? And what exactly are you going to do about it if we don't want to leave?" The veteran smiled slightly, the expression pleasant but somehow not reassuring. "I'm hoping that won't be necessary. I'm hoping you're smart enough to recognize when you're making a mistake." Marcus remained in his seat, but shifted his position subtly, ready to move if the situation required it. He could see that several other patrons were now watching the confrontation intently, some pulling out phones to record what they probably expected to be either a fight or an embarrassing retreat by the lone man facing down 4 younger, larger opponents. The drunk stepped closer to the veteran, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. "You know what I think? I think you're just another old man who watches too many action movies and thinks he's tough. Why don't you sit back down and mind your own business before you get hurt?" The veteran's expression didn't change, but Marcus noticed the slight shift in his stance, the way his weight settled more evenly on both feet. Professional fighters and martial artists learn to recognize these micro-adjustments, the body's preparation for violence that happen below the threshold of conscious thought. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," the veteran said conversationally as if discussing the weather. "2 in Iraq. I've been in situations where actual dangerous people tried to hurt me and my teammates. So when I tell you that you don't want this conversation to continue, I'm speaking from experience." The restaurant held its collective breath. This was the moment that would determine whether the evening ended with embarrassment or tragedy. The drunk was clearly processing what he'd been told, trying to decide if the claim was real or just an attempt to scare him. His friends had stopped laughing, some primitive instinct telling them that the game had suddenly become serious in ways they hadn't anticipated. Marcus watched the drunk's body language carefully. Alcohol and adrenaline were fighting with the survival instincts that kept people alive in truly dangerous situations. The veteran from Table 9 continued to wait patiently, his offer still standing. "Walk away now, before this becomes something nobody wants to deal with." Then the drunk made his choice. Instead of de-escalating, he drew back his right hand and swung a wild haymaker toward the veteran's head. It was a telegraphed, clumsy attack that anyone with basic defensive training could have avoided easily. But what happened next wasn't just avoidance. It was a demonstration of the difference between civilian conflict and military precision. The veteran moved with fluid efficiency that made the drunk's attack look like slow motion. He stepped inside the swing, caught the extended arm, and used the drunk's own momentum to guide him face first into the nearest table. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and looked more like a dance move than a fight. The drunk found himself pinned against the table with his arm controlled in a position that made resistance both painful and pointless. His 3 friends started to move forward, apparently planning to help their leader, but Marcus was already standing. He didn't say anything dramatic or make any threatening gestures. He simply positioned himself between them and their friend, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm but alert. The message was clear without words. They could try to escalate this into a 4-on-2 fight if they wanted, but they should think very carefully about whether that was really how they wanted their evening to end. The leader of the group was breathing heavily, his face pressed against the table, completely immobilized by what had appeared to be minimal effort. The veteran holding him spoke quietly, his voice barely audible to anyone else in the restaurant. "I'm going to let you go now," he said. "You're going to apologize to that young woman you frightened. You're going to pay your bill and you're going to leave. Your friends are going to help you make good decisions for the rest of the evening. Does that sound reasonable?" The drunk managed a strangled yes and was immediately released. He stood up slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but the fight had gone out of him completely. The veteran stepped back, giving him space while maintaining his ready posture. Marcus remained positioned to intercept any move by the friends, but they seemed to have lost their enthusiasm for confrontation as well. The apology was grudging but audible. The bill was paid quickly, with an overly generous tip that felt more like an attempt to buy forgiveness than genuine remorse. The 4 men left without further incident, their earlier bravado replaced by the sullen silence of people who had badly miscalculated a situation. As the restaurant slowly returned to normal, Marcus approached the veteran who had handled the situation with such professional skill. Up close, he could see the small scars and weathered features that spoke of serious military service, the kind of face that had seen real combat and emerged intact, but changed. "Navy SEAL?" Marcus asked quietly. The man smiled and extended his hand. "Retired. Team 3. Tom Bradley." Marcus shook his hand, feeling the calluses that never quite disappeared, even years after leaving active duty. "Army Rangers. Marcus Thompson. Thanks for the backup." "Thanks for having mine," Tom replied. "Always good to know there are still good people willing to stand up when it matters." They talked for a few more minutes, sharing the kind of conversation that happens when warriors recognize each other in civilian settings. Different branches, different specialties, but the same fundamental training and the same willingness to act when others need protection. They exchanged contact information, making the connections that often developed between veterans who found each other in the strangest circumstances. As Marcus returned to his table to finish his now cold dinner, he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. Not the adrenaline rush of combat or the satisfaction of completing a mission, but the deeper feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He had skills that most people would never need, training that seemed excessive for civilian life, instincts that sometimes felt out of place in the modern world. But tonight had proven that his training still had value, that the brotherhood forged in military service extended beyond uniforms and deployments, and that sometimes being ready for war was the best way to preserve peace. He smiled as he took another bite of his chicken parmesan, cold, but somehow tasting better than it had when hot. His phone buzzed with another message from his sister, asking if he was having a good evening. Marcus looked around the restaurant, where families were again enjoying their meals. Servers were smiling instead of trembling, and normal conversation had resumed. He typed back a simple response that captured everything he was feeling. Perfect night, see you tomorrow. 3 months after the incident at Romano's, Marcus found himself driving through suburban neighborhoods he'd never seen before, following GPS directions to an address Tom Bradley had texted him that morning. The message had been simple: BBQ at my place. 2 p.m. Bring yourself and your stories. It was the kind of invitation that would have meant nothing to most people, but Marcus understood it as something more significant, an invitation into a community he'd been missing without realizing it. The house was typical suburban family home, with a well-maintained lawn and children's bikes scattered in the driveway. Marcus could smell grilled meat from the backyard, and hear the sound of laughter mixed with classic rock music. As he walked around the side of the house, following a path marked with American flag stepping stones, he wasn't sure what to expect. Tom had mentioned that some other guys might be there, but had been vague about details. What Marcus found in the backyard was a gathering that looked like any other suburban cookout, with one crucial difference that became apparent as soon as he started meeting people. There was Jake Morales, a former Marine who now taught middle school and coached wrestling; Pete Johnson, ex-Air Force, who owned a local automotive repair shop; David Kim, another Navy veteran who worked as a paramedic. 8 men total, ranging in age from late 20s to early 50s, all looking completely ordinary while grilling burgers and drinking beer on a Saturday afternoon. The extraordinary became apparent in the details: the way they moved with unconscious awareness of their surroundings, the casual references to deployments and training that would sound like foreign languages to most civilians, the comfortable silence that existed between men who had learned to communicate without words in situations where talking could get you killed. Most telling was the immediate acceptance Marcus felt, not just as a guest, but as someone who belonged to a brotherhood that transcended individual service records. Tom introduced him around the group, and Marcus learned that this gathering happened monthly, sometimes more often when someone was struggling with the transition to civilian life or dealing with family problems. They called it the Backyard Battalion, a joke that had developed over the 2 years since Tom had started hosting these events. What had begun as 2 former SEALs sharing a beer had grown into something that filled a need none of them had fully understood until they found it. The conversation flowed between topics that would have seemed wildly disconnected to outsiders. David described a difficult call he'd responded to as a paramedic, where his military training in trauma medicine had saved a child's life. Pete talked about hiring another veteran at his shop, someone who was struggling with PTSD, but whose mechanical skills were exceptional. Jake shared stories about reaching kids in his classroom who reminded him of young soldiers he'd served with overseas. Tough exteriors hiding fear and uncertainty. What Marcus noticed was the complete absence of the competitive atmosphere that had characterized so much of their military service. Nobody was trying to prove anything or establish dominance based on their record or deployments. Instead, there was a genuine interest in each other's success and well-being that felt refreshing after years of civilian interactions, where people seemed guarded and superficial. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since leaving active duty. These were men who understood the challenge of maintaining skills and instincts that seemed excessive in civilian life. They talked about the difficulty of explaining military experience to people who had never faced life-or-death situations. They discussed the strange sense of loss that came with leaving a profession where your competence could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Tom pulled Marcus aside during a break in the conversation, walking toward the far end of the yard where a small vegetable garden showed evidence of serious attention and care. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, his tone suggesting this was more than casual conversation. "That night at the restaurant got me thinking about community responsibility." Marcus wasn't sure where this was leading, but he'd learned to pay attention when experienced operators wanted to discuss responsibility. "How so?" "We have skills that most people don't have," Tom continued. "Training that costs taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars per person. Experience in high-stress situations that could be valuable in emergency situations. But most of us are just living individual lives, not really contributing those skills to our communities, except when random situations like that restaurant thing happen." Tom explained that he'd been researching volunteer opportunities that could make use of military training in positive ways. Search and rescue operations, community emergency response teams, disaster relief coordination. "There are a lot of ways to serve without being in uniform," he said. "I've been thinking about whether we could do more than just get together and grill meat once a month." The idea appealed to Marcus immediately. One of the hardest parts of civilian life had been the sense that his training and experience were assets gathering dust, relevant only in theoretical emergency situations that might never arise. The possibility of using those skills to help people in concrete ways felt like a bridge between his military service and his civilian life. Their conversation was interrupted by laughter from the group around the grill, where someone was telling a story about a particularly incompetent commanding officer from their time at Fort Bragg. Marcus and Tom rejoined the group, but the seed of Tom's idea stayed in Marcus's mind throughout the rest of the afternoon. As evening approached and the gathering began to wind down, David Kim approached Marcus with a proposition that seemed to come out of nowhere. "How would you feel about helping me with a training program I'm developing?" he asked. "The fire department wants to improve their response to active shooter situations. They need someone with tactical experience to help design realistic scenarios." Marcus was surprised by the offer, but immediately interested. "What kind of commitment are we talking about?" "Couple hours a week to start. Help design training exercises, maybe participate in some of the scenarios. The goal is to give first responders better tools for dealing with situations that are beyond normal emergency response but not quite at the level where federal tactical teams get involved." It was exactly the kind of opportunity Marcus had been hoping for, without knowing how to find it. Meaningful work that used his specific skills while contributing to community safety. He accepted immediately, and they spent the next hour discussing the program's objectives and timeline. As the evening ended and the group began to disperse, Marcus realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of post-military life. For months, he'd been thinking about his transition from active duty as a process of leaving something behind. The excitement, the sense of purpose, the brotherhood that had defined his adult identity. But today had shown him that transition could also be about finding new ways to carry those things forward. Tom walked him to his car, and they talked about the volunteer emergency response idea in more detail. Tom had already reached out to the county emergency management office and learned that they were actively looking for experienced personnel to help with disaster planning and response. The pay would be minimal, but the work would be meaningful, and the skills directly applicable. "The thing is," Tom said as they shook hands goodbye, "we don't have to choose between military brotherhood and civilian life. We can build something that incorporates the best of both." Driving home through the same suburban neighborhoods he'd navigated earlier, Marcus felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. The skills and training that had sometimes felt like burdens in civilian life could become assets again. The brotherhood that had been so central to military service could be recreated in new forms that served community needs while maintaining the bonds between men who had shared extraordinary experiences. His phone buzzed with messages from several members of the group, sharing contact information and discussing David's first responder training program. Jake was interested in participating. Pete offered his shop as a meeting location if they needed space for planning sessions. Within hours of leaving Tom's backyard, a network was forming around the shared desire to use military experience in constructive ways. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the emergency response volunteer work with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt since his final deployment. The work was challenging in different ways than military operations, more focused on planning and preparation than on immediate action, but it required the same attention to detail and systematic thinking that had made him effective as a ranger. The first responder training program proved even more rewarding. Working with firefighters, paramedics, and police officers who were dedicated to protecting their communities reminded Marcus why he'd been drawn to military service in the first place. These were people who ran toward danger while others ran away, who put community welfare ahead of personal safety, who understood that some things were worth the risk. The training scenarios they developed were realistic enough to be genuinely stressful, but controlled enough to be safe. Marcus found himself drawing on experiences he'd thought would never be relevant in civilian life, translating lessons learned in urban combat zones into techniques that could save lives in schools, shopping centers, and office buildings. But perhaps most importantly, the work connected him to a sense of mission that had been missing since leaving active duty. Instead of feeling like his military experience was a closed chapter in his life, he began to see it as preparation for a different kind of service that was no less meaningful than what he'd done in uniform. 6 months after that evening at Romano's, Marcus stood in front of a group of police officers and firefighters, teaching them tactical principles that could keep them alive in active shooter situations. In the back of the room, Tom Bradley watched with the satisfaction of someone whose idea had grown into something larger than he'd originally envisioned. After the training session, as Marcus packed up his materials and prepared to head home, he reflected on the changes in his life since that night when a drunk college kid had provided the catalyst for everything that followed. He was still the same person with the same skills and experience, but now those attributes felt like assets rather than obstacles to building a meaningful civilian life. His phone showed a text from his sister Sarah, reminding him about Tyler's championship soccer game the following weekend. Marcus smiled and typed back his confirmation, adding that he might bring a friend from his volunteer work who had expressed interest in youth coaching. The integration of his military connections with his family life felt natural now, rather than like separate worlds that couldn't overlap. As he drove home through familiar neighborhoods that felt more like home than they ever had before, Marcus thought about the restaurant server who had been frightened by aggressive customers, the police officers who might face active shooters with better training because of his work, the community members who would be safer during natural disasters because of improved emergency response planning. The warrior's mission hadn't ended with military service. It had simply evolved into new forms that served the same fundamental purpose: protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. Service to something larger than individual needs. Brotherhood with others who shared the same commitment to community welfare. At a red light, Marcus glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror and saw something he hadn't seen in months: genuine satisfaction with the direction his life was taking. He was no longer a soldier, but he was still a protector. No longer in uniform, but still serving. No longer deployed overseas, but still fighting for things that mattered. The light turned green and Marcus drove toward home, toward family responsibilities, toward a civilian life that had finally learned to incorporate the best parts of everything he'd been trained to be. Behind him, the lights of the community center where he'd just finished training faded into the distance, but the sense of mission he'd rediscovered there would continue long after the building was dark and empty. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with skills and knowledge passed on to others. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from building communities strong enough to protect themselves. And sometimes the truest brotherhood is found not in shared danger, but in shared commitment to making the world safer for people who will never know your name. The evening was quiet. His duty was done, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve in ways he was still discovering. It was exactly the kind of life worth fighting for.